For a long time now, I've been kind of fascinated by bath salts. Maybe surprisingly, though, I'm not talking about the drug that's commonly known as bath salts, and I actually just mean the salt that you can get at the pharmacy to make a relaxing bath. At least here in Montreal, the most common one is Epsom salt, and this is specifically the one that I'm interested in. In stores, they sell it in huge bags or containers, and it's usually just a bunch of white crystals. However, what has always kind of blown my mind is that despite being completely dry, a huge portion of it is actually water. In fact, it's not even just a huge portion, and it's technically mostly water at around 53% by weight. All this water, though, isn't just absorbed on the Epsom salt like a sponge or something, and it's actually chemically part of it. This is why the proper chemical name for Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate heptahydrate, where hydrate is referring to water. The core compound is magnesium sulfate, but it has 7 water molecules that are chemically bound to it. In this form, the water's no longer a liquid, and it's part of the solid crystal structure. What I've always found really interesting, though, is that this water is only loosely bound. With just a bit of heating, the bonds should break, and the water should fall off. Also, as I mentioned before, 53% of it is supposed to be water, so from this 4-kilo container, there's at least in theory over 2 liters of pure water. That's almost enough to fill about half of it. To me, this all made sense on paper, and the science behind it appeared to be relatively simple. However, I still had a really hard time believing that there could actually be that much water. So I decided that I had to try it myself and to see if I got anything close to 2 liters. To make this happen, the plan that I came up with was relatively simple. I first had to heat up the Epsom salt to release the water, and then I had to distill off the water to separate it from the salt. To get this whole thing started, I pulled out the biggest flask that I had, and I filled it with as much Epsom salt as I could. At most, though, it would probably only hold about 1.5 kilos, and I figured that to do all of it, I'd have to do a few separate batches. When it looked pretty full, I took it off the stand and I dropped it into a big heating mantle. After that, I added a stopper, a short path condenser, and another stopper. I also had to add a thermometer, as well as the tubing that would be feeding the condenser with cold water. The last thing that I still needed was something to collect the water, and I just went with a 1-liter beaker. Now in theory, I was good to go, and I turned on the heating. At first, it didn't really seem like much was happening, and that's because there really wasn't. The water was only supposed to start coming off at around 150 C, and it was going to take a while for it all to heat up. After about 10 minutes, I noticed that the salt had sunk down a bit, which told me that something was happening. What was much more exciting, though, was the small amount of water that had condensed at the top of the flask. It wasn't anything even close to 2 liters, but it was definitely a good sign. Over another 10 minutes, it sank down even more, and there was a lot more water on the flask. This was kind of how I thought it was going to be the whole time, and I figured that the salt would just keep shrinking and slowly giving off water. However, barely a few minutes later, a small hole opened up in the corner, and I saw some boiling water. So apparently, there was a lot more water than I thought, and there was actually a huge pool that was hidden underneath. After this, it only took about 5 minutes for it to almost completely liquefy. At this point, I don't know exactly what form the magnesium sulfate was in, but I think it had given off most of its water. So now, instead of being the heptahydrate with 7 waters, it was probably the di or the monohydrate with only 2 or 1. After seeing this, I got pretty excited, and I really started to believe that getting 2 liters was actually going to be possible. Around the same time, the water vapor started slowly climbing the column, and it eventually made it to the cold condenser. This was turning all the vapor back into a liquid, and a small amount was building up. When there was eventually enough, it was able to make it out of the condenser, and I got my first drop of beautiful bath salt water. It was also coming over at a surprisingly decent rate, and within 10 minutes, I already had quite a bit. Now, going back to the flask, it looked like there was even more water, and it was all fully boiling now. It also looked like it was barely half full, which gave me an idea. My original plan was to keep heating it until there was absolutely no water left, and then to process the rest of the salt in a few separate batches. However, I started thinking that it might be possible to just keep topping up what I had here and to do it all in one shot. So I pulled off the stopper, added a funnel, and started pouring in some fresh bath salt. I filled it up with what I felt was a decent amount, and I sealed it again. I then waited for it all to heat up and for the water to fall off. It all eventually completely liquefied, and about 10 minutes after that, it was back to a boil. From this little test run, it definitely seemed that adding more was gonna be a viable method. I wanted to maximize the space before the next edition, though, and I decided to wait until there was almost no water left. So I patiently waited, and it ended up taking about 5 hours. I also kept collecting the water, and it was slowly adding up to a decent amount. When it eventually started slowing down, it was already up at around 900 mils. Looking back at the salt, it still seemed a bit wet, but I didn't see any actual liquid water. I then popped out the stopper again, and this time, I really tried to load it up. However, I kind of overestimated things, and I added way too much. I tried jamming it in, and it didn't work at all, and for a second, I was worried that I had messed up. But then I realized that all I had to do was wait for the stuff in the flask to liquefy and to make more space. After that, I was easily able to shove in everything, and there was still a whole bunch of space left. So, I decided to just keep adding more. I forced in as much as I could, and when it was completely full again, I waited about 15 minutes. Even after this, it was still barely over half full, and it definitely seemed like it was possible to add everything. It took a bit of effort and like 5 minutes of mixing things around, but I was eventually able to completely empty the container. I then waited for it all to melt again, shoved in everything that was in the funnel, and dropped in the stopper. A few minutes later, the water started coming over again. I let this beaker fill until it was around a liter, and then I swapped it out for a new one. At this point, I had 1 liter out of the theoretical 2, and I assumed that it would take about the same amount of time to get the other liter. Like before, the amount of water in the flask slowly decreased, and I collected more and more in the beaker. It seemed to be going just like it did before, and after around 5 hours, it looked like all the water in the flask was gone. This time, though, over in the beaker, there was only about 600 mils, and it wasn't even close to the liter I was hoping for. I think this is because the last bit of water is just a lot more stubborn. I imagine that most of the stuff here was now the monohydrate, and this had a much stronger bond with the water. To break it apart, it was going to take a much higher temperature, and unfortunately, probably a lot more time. Right now, it was at around 250 C, and I tried pushing it all the way up to around 350. Over the next 2 hours, I was able to squeeze out another 100 mils, but it was insanely slow. It was also getting really late, and I was now stuck with a problem. I could leave it overnight and let it finish, but I was worried about leaving something that hot completely unattended. On the other hand, though, I was really scared that if I turned it off now, that the flask would break. This is because, in general, it never ends well when you have to cool down a flask that has a huge chunk in it. When I started this, I kind of knew that the flask would die, and I was willing to sacrifice it. However, I only wanted it to die when I was actually done with it, and there was still a whole bunch of water that I had to get out. Ultimately, I decided to avoid the fire risk and to take my chances letting it cool down. So, I took away the beaker, and I turned off the heating mantle. It all initially seemed okay, but as I was getting ready to leave, I heard a pop from the other room. So I ran over and checked on it, hoping that it was just something else. That was sadly not the case, though, and there was a huge crack in the back of it. I wanted to take it all apart and to get a closer look at it, but it was still way too hot to touch, and I just left it overnight to cool. The next day, I took out all the pieces and I poked at the magnesium sulfate. I was expecting it to be tough and probably hard to break apart, but I was hoping that it wouldn't be too bad. However, what I had here felt like a block of cement. Now at this point, I basically had two options. I could keep going and get out the rest of the water, or I could just give up. I honestly did kind of just want to quit, but I decided to at least try. To do this, I had to move all this magnesium sulfate into a new and unbroken flask. So the first step was to get it out of this one. This left me with a solid brick of magnesium sulfate, which I now had to crush into a powder. To do this, I figured I'd start by just dropping it and letting it break itself. If anything, it sounded like my table was the only thing that broke. It was apparently even stronger than I thought, and to destroy it, I was gonna have to use a bit more force. I expected one hit to easily split it, and the fact that it took three kind of scared me. This was because it meant that this whole part was gonna be an absolute nightmare. Even the sharp end of the hammer didn't really work, and it still took way too many hits to break it. It really felt like I was trying to break apart a rock, and I had no idea how I was going to turn this all into a powder. Doing it manually like this seemed like it was going to be way too much work, and I decided to try and automate it. So I went online and I found a random comment that said an electric food grinder worked well for chalk. I of course didn't actually have chalk, but I felt that it was similar enough that it might work. In my mind, I was hoping that it would just get shredded like a piece of cheese. At first, it actually seemed like it was working, but it quickly stopped doing much of anything. The magnesium sulfate was just way too hard, and it had already dulled out the blade. Just for the fun of it, I swapped the blade out for a fresh one, and this one failed even worse. It kind of caught an edge, and there was way too much force on it, and part of it snapped. This was unfortunate, but to be fair, I have no idea how I thought it would actually work. It was way too ambitious to try basically grinding a rock using something that's meant for carrots and cheese. I was gonna have to use something a little more heavy duty, and a blender was the only other thing that I could think of. I was too afraid to use my good and expensive one though, and I got this one on sale for $20. Unlike before, it actually seemed to work, and it was making some powder. However, it wasn't very efficient, and it was mostly just bouncing the chunks around. I then tried it with just one piece, and it still had the same issue. It didn't have the power to break it, and it was just slowly shaving off small bits of it. This was really inefficient, to say the least, and it would take forever to process everything like this, assuming the blender would even survive. So unfortunately, the power tools weren't working for me, and it was looking like I was gonna have to do things manually. I definitely wasn't going back to just trying to use a hammer though, and I instead used this pipe with a cap on it. I dropped in one of the pieces that failed to blend, and then I smashed it with a smaller pipe. This is a method that's commonly used to crush rocks, and it seemed to work pretty well. There were still some chunks left in it, but it was mostly destroyed. In this dry powdered form, the magnesium sulfate really likes to pull moisture from the air, so it was important to transfer it all to a sealed container. After that, I continued smashing the rest of it. At first, it seemed like it was going to be okay, but it was honestly kind of a nightmare, and I spent the next 5 hours just smashing two pipes together. It was also a bit messy, and it was impossible to not lose some of the powder. When I was eventually done, there were still some pieces that I felt were too big. So I put everything through the blender, which actually worked for these smaller pieces. This left me with a decent and very dry powder, and it really didn't look like it had any water in it. Again, in theory though, I knew that there had to be, but I had that same doubtful feeling that I had with the original stuff. But either way, I now had to do pretty much the exact same thing that I did before. The only difference was that this time, I was going to crank the heat up a lot higher and bring it to around 400 C. When it got to around 350, I started to see some water vapor condensing on the sides. Shortly after that, I got some water drops coming over. The rate was much slower than before, but it still seemed to be decent. So, it was looking like that last bit of water was breaking off, and I was really hoping that I'd be able to get everything that I was missing. Of course, this decent rate didn't last for long though, and it really started to slow down. To squeeze out the last bit, I was gonna have to insulate it with aluminum foil and wait for it to get to 400 C. It actually started coming over again at a decent rate, but it had a slight murkiness to it, which slowly got worse and worse. It also had a really strong sulfur smell, and it made the room smell like I had just set off some fireworks. At first, I thought that it might have been from the magnesium sulfate breaking down under the high heat. However, I don't actually think that's the reason, because magnesium sulfate only starts decomposing around 1000 C. I think it was just from some sulfur contamination and maybe some other impurities that were in the bath salt. When it got to around 100 mils, it got insanely slow. I was really hoping to get the full amount that I was missing, which was about 394 mils, but at this rate, it would take days. So I ended up quitting when it got to around 240 mils, which took almost 10 hours. After this, I slowly ramped down the temperature of the heating mantle and I kept the flask covered. I was hoping that this would reduce the shock on the flask and prevent it from cracking. I came back to it a few hours later and it had actually survived. I then took everything apart and I emptied out the now super dry magnesium sulfate. It was still not completely water free, but it was very close. So now, coming back to the water from the last run, I was actually able to get quite a bit. However, it was also way nastier than I expected. So, I decided to try and clean it up. I initially planned to just pour it through a Brita filter, but I didn't think that it would be powerful enough. So instead, I made my own industrial strength one. To do this, I filled a funnel with some activated charcoal that I got from the pet store. I then poured all my gross water through it, and it looked just as bad on the other side. However, I wasn't surprised by this, and the charcoal was mostly to get rid of the smell. One pass wouldn't work though, so I swapped it with a clean beaker, and I poured it all through again. I then did this 3 more times, and it got rid of most of the smell, and it cleared up slightly. After that, I tested the pH, and it was decently acidic, which wasn't good. So I set up another filter using something called a mixed ion exchange resin. This can sometimes also be found at the pet store because it can be used to clean aquarium water. Along with the charcoal, this is the other main part of a typical Brita filter, and it pulls out dissolved ions. From just the first pass, it already looked a lot less cloudy. I also repeated it 3 times, and it looked significantly better each time. Now when I tested the pH, it looked like it was slightly above 6, which was very close to neutral. The water now also had almost no smell, and it was definitely way better than before. So, in the end, this was all the water that I was able to get out. Even though I believed the science and I expected it to work, the amount was somehow still surprising. In total, I was able to get a bit over 1900 mils, which wasn't quite the theoretical 2046, but it was extremely close. I'm assuming that the missing 151 mils was still just stuck in the salt. Now, to really get an idea of how much water this was, I had to pour it all back into the original container. As I thought from the beginning, it was enough water to fill nearly half the container, which is kind of crazy. But anyway, I now had a bunch of bath salt water, and I just had to know what it tasted like. Okay, so it's unfortunately time to taste it and see how horrible it probably is. So the first thing I'll do is smell it, and it doesn't smell very good. It smells like a weak version of kind of the nasty sulfur stuff that I just cleaned up. It's not horrible, it just kind of smells a bit like stale old water. So I guess I'll just taste it now. It kind of just tastes like bad tap water. But not sure why. The first taste was much better than the second one. The second one was kind of a bit sour, and it makes me think that I definitely didn't get out everything from that nasty third run. It was still a bit acidic, and I think that's what I'm tasting. But either way, I don't think it was going to be very good anyway. So the taste is kind of horrible, but what I do kind of find interesting is that I have no idea where this water really came from. I mean, I know I took it out of the Epsom salt, but where the Epsom salt picked that water up is kind of a mystery. I originally assumed that it was probably from the manufacturing process that's used to make the Epsom salt, but what it seems to be more likely is that Epsom salt is just mined from a natural source, and it probably just picked it up from its environment. And I guess depending on how old this Epsom salt was, it could be really old water. Maybe this is ancient water. But either way, I have a whole bunch of it, so I've decided that I'll give away a few bottles of it, a few little small bottles of my own bath salt water. And if you guys want it, there's a link in the description that you can sign up for a chance to get it. I mean, I don't know why you want it, but in the end, this project took way longer than I thought, and it was kind of a disaster, but I think it was worth it. One thing that I did want to mention, though, was that this video wasn't meant to show that Epsom salt is a scam or something. I mean, it might be, but as far as I know, there are actually some practical reasons to sell it as the heptahydrate. The first is that the dehydrated form reacts strongly with water, and it can generate enough heat to cause serious burns. It also doesn't dissolve very well, and it tends to clump up and form bricks, like the one I had to deal with.